And we're live. Welcome to Gauntlet Con's panel. We are going to be talking about running horror games. I'm Christopher Gray, but I'd like to introduce the panel. I'm hearing some feedback.
That's me. I'm sorry.
I'd like to introduce the technical difficulties. Let me figure out how to fix that. I'm hearing some feedback.
You might have the YouTube link on.
Difficulties. Let me figure out how to fix that. I have YouTube on. Oh, okay, that's an easy fix. We're off to a game. We're off to a great start, fellas. We are doing great. Okay.
Yay!
Whoa! Hello, everyone. I actually pulled YouTube up so I could drop the link into Discord. So I'm going to do that right now. And let's go ahead and take our turn introducing ourselves. Since I have a particular order on my screen, why don't we start with, well, let's just mix it up here. What about Shane? Why don't you start?
Sure. I'm Shane. Number of games on the Gauntlet. I started the Tragic Tuesdays, during which I've run maybe about 10 plus sessions of Bluebeard Bride, a number of sessions of The Watch, Cthulhu Dark, through to Lindisfarne. You get the also a few horror-infused OSR games. This is a topic that's near to my heart, and I look forward to chatting with you guys.
Awesome. Sharang, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, so I'm Sharang Biswas. I'm a game designer, artist, and writer in New York. This con is my first involvement with the Gauntlet, which is very exciting for me. And I have made a couple of games that are kind of creepy. Though I don't know if I would call them horror, but I think horror is in the eye of the beholder. I was actually on a similar panel at the Living Games conference in Boston this year, talking about horror in games. And that spurred a lot of interesting discussion. So I'm looking forward to this one.
I have a friend who's on a horror movie podcast, and they keep getting asked, "Is this movie horror?" And so their answer is everything. Every movie is horror.
With the right soundtrack and the right cuts, absolutely.
True.
So, Ollie, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure, I am Ollie Jeffery. I run occasional, mostly horror games on the Gauntlet, run a couple during the con. I do some games design. I have currently designing Creep, which is a melancholy horror stripped-down hack of Blades in the Dark, and just generally lifelong horror and RPG fan.
I'm Chris. I'm most known for The Happiest Apocalypse on Earth, which is a game about Lovecraftian horror in a children's theme park. So it gets a little scary. It also gets a little funny. And sometimes the line's a little fuzzy when you talk about horror and humor. I'm also a lover of horror games. I bring it into every game I play, including D&D. I run Call of Cthulhu. I run Chronicles of Darkness. I just got Vampire. So I'm pretty immersed in the genre. My wife is a horror author. So that's our life. You know, we just like scary things.
Excellent.
So just to start our discussion here, I'd like to get an idea on why horror. You know, we all as a panel seem to be interested in this particular genre. What does it mean to you? And when you are a game master running some sort of horror game, or if you're injecting horror into your game, what's the purpose of doing that?
I mean, I think for me, it's just kind of playing to my strengths. The question of like why horror, I don't really know, because I get asked this a lot. I get asked, why you watch scary movies, and the standard answer is because it's like a roller coaster, and then the follow-up question is, yeah, but why roller coasters? And I don't know, but it's a genre that I'm kind of entrenched in. I've kind of grown up with that, and when I'm GMing it, that's what I do especially well. So I kind of like you said, even when I'm doing D&D or Dungeon World or whatever, I bring a little horror, and it's kind of hard not to do that, because like the early modules, you've got Ravenloft and stuff like that. You go to the monster manual, and there's a huge section on the undead. So I think it's kind of entrenched in the hobby. I think, yeah, in terms of why I GM horror, it's because I can do that well. Like, I can't do cyberpunk as well as I can do horror, so no one really wants to hang out with me and talk about robots for a while. They want to hang out with me and talk about zombies.
What does horror do to a game? We talked about interjecting it, and when you go into a Call of Cthulhu game, you kind of know what to expect. But there's a reason for experiencing that. So what is it that horror does to a table, to a game, to an environment, and how can the purpose of bringing horror to the table? How can you as a GM set that tone, set the expectation for horror? We have to think that people are coming to the table for different reasons. If I'm playing a World of Darkness game, it's because I want to explore a personal horror, probably. But if I'm playing a D&D game or even an OSR game, there might be something else there. Maybe it's more of shock. So I guess this is a two-part question. How do you first identify why people are coming to the game for horror and the purpose of bringing it into your game? And two, how do you set the table so that everybody's on board with your version of horror and the reason for doing it? Or is that too broad a question? Do you want to take it, Sharang?
So I can start. Yeah. So first off, just to quickly answer the first question, in that I rarely make games intending for it to be horror unless I have been told you are making a horror thing. So I made an immersive theater thing for grad school, but I was like, you are making a haunted house, go. And I'm like, great. But when I made the things I've made that I would consider horror or creepy, like I said, I didn't start by being, I'm making a horrific experience, ta-da. But of course, those were not, when I was making it, I wasn't making it in front of players. I was making it and then telling people, play this with your players. Obviously, if I have players in front of me, I would say this is a horror experience because I don't want them to be, surprised by what I'm throwing at them. I don't want them to not have emotions they don't want. But I think horror can achieve a couple of things. And the main thing I'm thinking of is I've run Bluebeard's Bride a lot. For a variety of different people, a variety of, like, my sister who'd never played a role-playing game before, the first game she ever played was Bluebeard's Bride, run by me. And I played with, professors of game design. And there, horror is used in a very specific way, right? Horror is used to make a very pointed argument about domestic abuse and sexual violence and things like that. And so there, horror, I think, functions as hyperbole because it may be very difficult to play a game that is explicitly and realistically about domestic abuse and sexual violence. But if you elevate it to the horror level with supernatural elements, then you can discuss that or think about those issues in a more digestible way. I mean, that's what speculative fiction is often about, right? Allowing things to be digestible by hyperbolizing or by taking it, divorcing it from reality. So I think that's interesting, but I also think from another point, like I've run Curse of Strahd more than once, and I really, really like running Curse of Strahd because I get to dress up like a vampire and speak in a cool voice. And wear my bloody white glove, which I really like. And there, I think, I mean, there's an article I read recently about Curse of Strahd as a gothic horror. So yes, obviously you can see it. It comments on this artistic and literary form that has existed for a long time, and that allows you to draw into that. But I also think this, we play interactive fiction, and I'm using that term very loosely. I'm not meaning like Twine game necessarily. I'm meaning any kind of storytelling that's interactive, like tabletop role-playing games. We play that to like find out what's going to happen, right? And I think horror is really cool because I feel that what's going to happen is more enhanced in a horror story because what's going to happen is kind of keeping you on edge rather than, oh, what's going to happen in this great game about making out with boys, which is wonderful. I'm talking about two boys kissing. But it's also it has less stakes. And so in horror, the stakes of what's going to happen are enhanced, and that heightens the reason why we play the game to begin with. That was very long. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's fine. So let's say when you come to the table with a horror experience in mind or a horror game in mind, and you come to the table and you think, oh, I'm expecting, let's say I'm running 10 candles. I'm expecting a certain experience as a game master. Is there a way, Shane, maybe you can take this. Is there a way to align the table around your expectations, or is it you aligning yourself around the table's expectations? And how do you get everybody on the same board? Because somebody might come in expecting Chucky the doll murder slasher, and then they're going to get some slow moving, suspenseful terror. So how can you manage expectations at the table?
I think I think the easiest way is to just talk to your players directly. I think that's a pretty. I think it is a way that few people use, but it is a way to do it, is to openly discuss these things, like what is interesting for people, what is it that they're looking for to get out of the game. You can bring your own thing, etc. But I think this is one of the reasons why one of the things that I found really interesting about Bluebeard's Bride is just how much information that the groundskeeper, that's the term for the MC GM role, how much information they get from the character creation process. The questions that are asked during that are directly meant to inform what you're going to do. So it's this method of indirection to get information about what is on your players' minds, what scares them, what makes them anxious.
You kind of basically you build the whole game from there, don't you? So I think more than in any other game that I've played, Bluebeard's Bride's character creation, there's this thing that kind of world creation and character creation is play, and to an extent it is, but it's kind of lonely fun usually. But that's half the game in Bluebeard's Bride. Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
And I think getting back to the why do we like horror question, I think for me that's one of the things that I like most is I'm interested both in experiencing at the table and also having other people experiencing the table strong emotions. And I think that horror is kind of people don't expect to have certain emotions in horror games, but I feel like that also kind of leaves them open to feeling different but still strong emotions. I think you can get you can slip in under there. Basically, they're expecting the scary stuff, they're expecting the gore and stuff like that, so they're amped and ready for that. But then when you can slide in some other stuff that is creepy or is disturbing, and it hits them with a lot more punch than I think they themselves are ready for. I think this is to a certain extent, 10 Candles, you brought that up, does this in a certain interesting way, because it starts out by saying, you are going to die, but play your characters and play the game, this 2 hours or however long it's going to be, play as if you are not going to die. And that kind of tweaking of expectations and beliefs in your head, I think ends up making the final moments of that game so impactful, because we're having to hold on to these two things at the same time, and one of them usually, I think, drives forward, and when that isn't going to happen, it really hits.
Sharang was talking earlier about how horror kind of takes an issue and then kind of dresses it up to the point of hyperbole, and you are going to die, but play as if you're not going to. That's just life. That's kind of the whole thing. That's what we're all doing all the time, isn't it? We all know we're going to die, but we kind of continue as if we're not going to, because otherwise we would go mad.
So we had some questions coming in. One of those associated directly with 10 Candles, since you brought it up, and this particular issue of knowing the outcome of the game before you come in. This question is from Maria, and she asks, what's your opinion on games like 10 Candles where you know the ending, and how do you play to find out what happens if you know what's going to happen? I'm paraphrasing a bit. I know in 10 Candles there's sort of a hope it's a hope mechanic, but it's not the purpose of the hope mechanic isn't really why they have it in there. I think there's this idea of hope. You focus on hope, not on the outcome of the session. But what are your thoughts on that? How do you play as a GM? How do you get the table interested in a story when they know how it's going to turn out?
So I would love to answer this, unless someone else wants to chime in first. So sadly, I have actually not yet played 10 Candles, but I get the question because other games have that as well. Like, so we're talking about Bluebeard's Bride. Explicitly, you are asked to tell the folktale before starting to play the game. And I think, so I think that's really powerful, actually. So I'm in the like the freeform and Nordic LARP communities a lot, right? And in many of those communities, you often pre-negotiate the ending of a scene. Not always, but you often decide about this is the direction we're going to go, and then you just start playing it. And some people have voiced to me the worry that, oh, does this diminish and blah, blah, blah. But I don't think so, because I think that humans are very good at compartmentalizing. So this fear of the unknown that I talk about can be like the unknown, a micro unknown rather than a macro unknown, if that makes sense. So yes, we know where we're going, but we don't know all the steps it takes to get there, and those steps can still be horrific, right? Or horrific, I don't know. But I think that's also what drives us to watch many horror movies. Like, we often know the ending of horror movies, but we can still derive pleasure and all the emotions of suspense and all that on the way. I remember the best example of this is silly, but I was watching in college Harry Potter 6. And I'm going to give a spoiler because it's an ancient book, so sucks to be you. But you know the scene at the end where he touches the water and the inferi, the corpses all leap out and grab him, right? So I have read each Harry Potter book, except the 7th one, at least 3 times. And obviously everyone knows we discuss a lot, but I watched the movie and that scene was coming and I was still gripping my seat. And then when the inferi came out of the water, I literally screamed in the cinema. Everyone turned around to stare at who's this random brown kid screaming. But anyway, so I knew exactly scene by scene what was going to happen, but the way it happened still scared me, right? And so in a game like, I presume 10 Candles, and a game like Bluebeard's Bride, it isn't even to that granular detail. You just know the ending, but getting there can be really cool, especially because your other players and your DM and things are going to add interesting things. And the horror, I didn't mean to say horror is only about the fear of the unknown. A lot of other things contribute to horror, like the sensory descriptions and things like that. So I actually really like games where the ending is known if they're executed well.
I think sort of at the very other kind of end of the spectrum of the romantic comedy films, for example, and to a lesser extent romantic comedy games, which are sort of like coming up now, you know what's going to happen there, but it's not playing to find out what happens, both in horror or even in fantasy. In fantasy that you're probably going to save the day. In horror that some people are going to die, one person will probably survive and kill the killer. It's playing to find out what happens isn't about the end necessarily. It's about finding out how you get there. It's about the experience as you go along.
Yeah, one thing we're kind of skirting around here, talking about setting expectations, understanding what is in store, is this idea of safety. We have a couple of components to this. First of all, there are, in this particular genre, objectively a lot of things that can be triggering, probably more so than other genres. And it could be something as severe as sexual violence, or it could be something like the fear of spiders, or it could be, I just don't like this kind of horror. I, for one, don't really care for body horror. It's fine. I appreciate it. My wife can watch those movies all day long, but that's not the kind of horror that I like. So I wouldn't want a 10 Candles game that had a lot of that. So, what can we do about safety mechanics? We have a question here too related to that. from Ferret, who said, how do you handle topics that you may not have any real life connection or concept with, like this male who runs Monster Hearts? And what if you're doing something you don't have a personal connection with? So are you doing it wrong, or are you going to do it in a way that offends other people? And how can you set up safety not only for yourself, but how can you set up safety for other people with things that you're doing? Horror touches on all of these topics.
I mean, with the very specific example of Monster Hearts, because I'm sure there's many games that don't do that, but Monster Hearts is it's probably my favorite game of all time. If you play to the rules, if you play it as it's written, you'll get it right, because Avery wrote it as a trans woman, so she is going to bring that in. If you play it if you play it as written, the machinery will do it for you. And Monster Hearts in particular is a very kind of mechanical game. You literally can't play Monster Hearts straight. It doesn't allow it. That's not in the makeup of that game. So I think there you've got a very good safety net. And sorry, carry on.
We know a lot of the safety mechanisms that the Gauntlet as a community uses, and obviously we don't need to recap every tool that's out there. But in the context of horror games, when you are thinking in terms of safety mechanics, for my part, when you are at a table with no safety mechanics, I tend to restrain my gameplay, because I'm afraid that I might tread into territory that I don't think I can get out of. If there's no safety mechanic in there, I'm more reserved, because I don't want to accidentally into a place where I can't leave. And so having safety at the table actually allows me to be a little bit more daring, because I know that if I go too far, I can always pull out. What are your thoughts about how safety mechanics can actually improve the game, and what particular tools have you used on games that have been effective?
So one thing that I've used that I think is underrated is early on just announcing. I think things like that's going to happen. And I'm going to come back to Bluebeard, because it's very relevant to this, and it's relevant to the last question, in that the game is designed to talk about feminist horror, right? That is the stated purpose of the game. Clearly, I am not clearly, that's a bad way of saying it, but people who know me know that I'm not a woman, and when I run it from them, they know I'm not a woman, and I've never had the experience of being a woman, and have never been subjected to feminine horror. But like stating that at the start is very powerful. Like, hey, I am a man, and I have not had these experiences. I am basing this on what I know and what I've read, and the actual plays that I've listened to in preparation for this. And that is, so I also talk about that in similarly to some of the themes that come up. For example, one of the room threats in Bluebeard's Bride is abortion, right? And that is clearly in the game, and I have never had an abortion, and my partner will never have an abortion, because my partner is a man who does not have a uterus. So I will not experience that in the same way as other people might. But I talk about, so this is a game of feminist horror. These are my experiences, and it will touch on some themes such as and then I ask, if you don't want to see any of those themes, or if there are other things you don't want to see, let me know, and I will modify. I always do that before safety mechanics, as in explicit mechanics, like like X card and all that stuff, because that preempts a lot of things. So we don't even have to enter the territory that people don't want to before having to X card it, and that also I think at least at my tables helps create a sense of trust that the players and the DM are kind of in this together, that they're shared storytelling, that this is my experience and this is what I'm doing, and people will respond like, oh, we understand and trust you, we know that you're not trying to misrepresent in some way. So I found that to be very effective when I've run games.
Now you bring up a point that was, I think, what Ferret wanted to clarify. I didn't touch on exactly right. Before the safety mechanic comes into play, is there a process for researching topics in which you're not familiar with? You bring up abortion, for example, or that you may never have to encounter. What's your process in familiarizing yourself with those kinds of issues? We lost Shane again. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as much as I said earlier about that, Monster Hearts will kind of support you. There was Bluebeard's Bride will do that as well. Like the even if you don't know anything, even if you don't know about the topics that you're discussing in the game, the room threats, the sort of the list of stuff that can happen that they have in the book, it will allow you to do that. But there are still some topics in there that I'm not going anywhere near because I don't feel comfortable talking about them, and that's kind of like that's at my end of stuff. So my Bluebeard's Bride game didn't feature any overt sexual violence because I just don't. That's not something I feel comfortable going anywhere near. But to go back to the topic of kind of like lines and veils at the start, I think that's sometimes kind of difficult because when you're going into, like you have to say that at the start of a game, but say that's kind of like the coldest point in the game, if you will. That's the game when that's the kind of the point where people feel the kind of the least connection to the game, and it can be difficult saying, you know, things that make you uncomfortable right off the bat because they make you uncomfortable. So that can be difficult. You don't want to suddenly come in and kind of like dump all of your neuroses necessarily on the table and then go, oh god, everyone's looking at me strangely now. So I think that's why something like a reactive tool like the X card or scene change, things like that can be good because they allow you to, I say, you said earlier, they allow you to go into territory that could be very tense, could be kind of triggering for people, and know that you can get out of it again without having to kind of like analyze that too much at the start. But I appreciate different strokes for different folks.
Shane, I know on the topic of, by the way, Shane's still here. He's just having bandwidth issues, so it's going to switch to audio for a while. On the topic of safety tools, I know you had brought up some pitfalls you've run into, and particularly around, you know, listening to what people say, using things like the support flower. Did you want to go into detail on a particular tool that's worked for you?
I think not necessarily a particular tool. I think there's something that I think kind of that can sometimes read into this as a GM. You oftentimes come into the games with the idea of what it is that you want to do and the types of things you want to cover, the types of subject matter, etc. And I think it's what can sometimes happen, especially if you say, if you do like lines and veils or something like that at the beginning, you need to make sure that you are very honest and understanding of anything that gets brought up there. If they say they have something, then just take that and write it down, and you're not going to do that. Even if you have like plans for it or anything of that nature, like that's where you need to go.
Yeah, you can't push back. I've had I was playing in a game without an X card, and something came up which made me feel uncomfortable. It was a mental health thing, and I was like, "Can we not do that?" And the GM was like, "No, you rolled it. You have depression." I was like, "I don't want to have depression. That's that's not something I want to play through in this game." And there wasn't any capacity for that. So yeah, you absolutely have to listen, because I just spent the rest of that game completely bummed out, ironically.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can definitely, and like I did this once, and it turned out that basically I kind of like made someone of an offhand remark about something that someone had wanted lined off, and it really like detracted from their whole experience. I found out later on, and I felt awful about that. So that's something to keep in mind, is that a lot of the games that we are talking about with horror here can go into some very extreme content, and that is something that we need to really understand and respect, and that we need to get buy-in from everyone and be honest and open about and understanding about where their limits are, and be completely okay with those.
We talked a lot about, which I think is really important, especially with horror, safety tools and the idea of setting expectations. We could probably do an entire panel just on those topics, but let's talk about horror a bit. We can probably agree, and let me know if you disagree, that using tropes in horror is an effective way of implementing and reversing those tropes, probably as well. How have tropes worked for you? I'll give you an example for horror. I tend to like the cosmic, sort of Lovecraftian horror in my games, and I found that I cinematically like to rush things as a game master. And so one of the things that I've done in support of that trope is to, slow the hell down and to take my time with the horror and to focus on the details and not like Kool-Aid man my way through the wall with chainsaws, and so that's something, paying attention to the tropes of Lovecraft has made me a better GM in that regard. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I play quite trope heavily when I do horror, because I'm kind of lazy. And if you're playing stuff that people know, there's that familiarity. There's like so say you can hear a joke and you can see where the joke's going, and you kind of start laughing before you get to the end. And if you can kind of see where the horror's going, you get that's the closest that we have to that sort of that rising string. So when those strings are coming in a horror movie, something scary is going to happen, or probably it looks like something scary is going to happen, and then it doesn't, and then something scary happens over here instead. But that if people can kind of see where it's going, then you get to play with dramatic irony, because the players know what's going to happen, but the characters don't, and they go into that cabin in the woods anyway. Yeah.
And I find tropes are just useful in general because, on the fly storytelling is difficult. We like saying, oh yeah, we're role playing games. It's so easy. We do it all the time. But for new players or for many people, it is very difficult. And even for us experienced DM, we can be like, what happens next? And so just latching onto tropes can be very powerful. And tropes are tropes for a reason, right? Because they sing to us in some way. They latch onto some like emotional resonance or some cultural symbolism or something. And so in any genre, not just horror, tropes can be useful and effective.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the entire point of Dungeon World, isn't it? Dungeon World is basically a 200-page book of lean into tropes because it works really, really well. I mean, if you look at Call of Cthulhu, the first back of the book adventure in Call of Cthulhu is literally just called The Haunted House. I mean, you can't get much more basic than that. It's a spooky ass house, and it's great. It's one of my favorite like back of the book adventures because it's so tropey, because then it allows you to do strange little stuff around the outside. You can decorate around the outside. I've run it maybe 3-4 times, and it's been a different adventure every time because of the people that come to it, the reasons for going there, everything like that. But once you get there, you're gonna have banging upstairs, you're gonna have stuff that smashes, and that stuff is just kind of intrinsically creepy.
So I'm gonna play the counterpoint here, and it's interesting because this cycles back up to what interests us about horror and what our background in horror is. I've never been someone who has watched much in the way of horror films. I'm not someone who has read a ton of horror literature. I mean, I've read a whole lot of Lovecraft and some Stephen King, etc., but not a whole lot of watching movies and the like. But I know what creeps me out, and I also know that going kind of at a certain clip can tend to worry people. I think it gives me, especially, this is more of like a technique more than anything else, it gives me time to think about what would work correctly, what would scare people as we go. And like, I know certain tropes along the lines of like the creepy stuff. I mean, one of my favorite books in this regard is Haunting of Hill House, which is just, that's things knocking around outside and you go in the hallway and not seeing anything, things being caught in the side of your eyes. But outside of that, I end up having to, because I don't know the tropes, and I'm, to be honest, like, watching tons of horror stuff isn't super interesting to me. I like thinking about it. I like thinking about what scares me, what kind of worries me about life and what could happen. And those are things that tend to feed into I think that's also another reason why I tend to do a bunch of kind of Lovecraftian stuff, is the whole, it's all going to go to hell horribly, Cthulhu is going to rise eventually. So keeping that in mind, like that hopelessness and whatnot, is something that's kind of tends to be ease, and explaining that and bringing the players into that is that I without too much work. I guess is a long way of saying that you can still run horror without really being well versed in the tropes. You just need to think about what scares you as a human being.
Yeah, no, I'd agree, because I don't really I don't read a lot of fantasy novels necessarily, but I love fantasy gaming. So my tropes are my tropes are D&D fantasy when I'm running that, rather than say Tolkien or Narnia or anything like that. There's a very specific D&D fantasy, which is what I can run, because that's kind of my knowledge there.
And I think there's also this thing about, so I love Lovecraft-esque, right? I think it's really wonderful, because not only, well, I forgot that part of the sentence, but the thing is that everyone can bring in what they find horrific, right? Like what Shane was saying, if you haven't played Lovecraft-esque, like each of you contributes a narrative, and then they kind of, you're forced to build off of each other to think about what the mystery could be. And that's really cool, because if something is horror for you, you will include that. And if something's horror for them, they will include that. And then you will reincorporate and incorporate. And something that is good to remember is that if you have a good game is where everyone buys into the social contract, right? If you say we are coming in to play Lovecraft-esque, everyone knows that you want to make a game about unknowable cosmic horror. And that makes it so that people will try and feel unknowable cosmic horror, will try and create unknowable cosmic horror. And I think that's really important, that everyone is, like, either it's a trope or it's a personal experience of now, but people will try and hopefully, will try and read in as much horror as they can, because that is the experience they have bought in to get. That is, of course, if you're a good faith player and not just a random troll person, but
I think that's super important, actually, the thing you say about the social contract, because I think horror has quite a bad reputation in role-playing games, because most people will play with the same kind of group every week. And so when you say about how do you get buy-in? I think getting buy-in from like your regular gaming group is super hard. I think the best way to play a horror game is with a bunch of people that want to play a horror game, and that's not necessarily going to be your gaming group every week. That's why, if I can be kind of mildly sycophantic for a second, that's why something like Gauntlet Hangouts works really well, because you put the game there, and if people want to play it, they'll sign up for it. This won't just be like your buddies that are turning up anyway, and you've got your pizza, and last week you're playing D&D, and now you're playing 10 Candles, and like, what the fuck is this candle game? People who have signed up for 10 Candles would be like, yes, I'm excited. I want all the doom. I want to be sad and scared at the same time. So I think horror is a very specific thing. Like anyone can kind of rock up and run some fantasy, some cyberpunk, whatever, and like, as I mean, we're kind of like general purpose nerds, we will enjoy that. But horror is it's a difficult thing. If you're not signed up for horror, if you're not, as Sharang said, if you're not a good faith player, it's just going to die on its ass. If people aren't there to be scared, it's not going to work. Everyone needs to be bought into that.
If I could toss in one quick point on that, I think that's also one of the reasons why you are able to kind of go a little bit further with a lot of horror games, is because people are they know ahead of time in general, at least if you're talking about playing a horror game as opposed to putting horror into another game. But for example, again, we keep coming back to Believer's Ride, but like 99% of the time, people know what they are getting into with that game, and that I feel gives you a lot of extra buy-in. Like they know what they are getting into, and so you can feel a little bit freer at what it is that you're going to throw at them.
Yeah, with 10 Candles, you know that you're going to die, so you don't have to hold back. You're not protecting your character. You're protecting how your character is going to go. Are there, speaking of 10 Candles, this is a segue. What if we have a built-in suspense mechanic in that game, where every round of failure means depleted resources, and eventually you have nothing. Your dice have become lowered every time you fail, and there's literally nothing you can do it. So there's built-in suspense. Dread obviously is a good example of a built-in suspense game where it's just suspenseful on a meta level, which translates into your character. What are your thoughts about? Because I think one of the things with running horror games is presenting suspense, taking away resources and as part of the narrative, and the less you have, and against the bigger odds, or you're running from the slasher and you're now cornered, and so all your escape routes are gone. And what can we do as game masters to create narrative tension that does the same kind of thing, that brings you into the game and feeling the duress that your characters do? And how do you handle that?
So I have one or two specific things. First off, I actually want to draw a quick distinction between a game like 10 Candles, again, which I haven't played, and a game like Lovecraft's Desk, where in 10 Candles, you all know the horror is happening, but your characters are trying to get away from it. In Lovecraft Desk, you are all very driving your character into the horror, and there's a subtle difference there that I'm not articulating really well. I have to think about that and then write an article about it. But I think that's interesting, and that affects that. But to be specific, something I learned a while ago was when the Curse of Strahd book came out. I hadn't run a lot of horror stuff at that time, and there was a very specific piece of advice in there which said, at least for that book, which is meant for campaign play, it's relevant. Thing is gloom and doom and dark that can be kind of emotionally exhausting. And you get inured to that. But one thing they recommended, every once in a while, there should be something lovely or fun or joyous, a small moment. The example they gave was maybe they'll see a pretty flower and you can describe the delicate, tiny, pretty detail over there. I think that is a very useful piece of advice, and I think that's really cool. And then the second thing I want to say is, when I run horror games, I take pains. So this is a meta technique, sort of, in that I embody that in my performance a lot. So rather than just the way I run the game, so when I run Curse of Strahd, I dress up in all black and I speak with a high British accent and I pretend sort of to be Stradish. When I run Bluebeard's Bride, I often wear a face mask, and that I only lower when an NPC is speaking, and I keep it on my face when NPC is not speaking, and I speak very slowly and like this, and I like change the way I look at people, like I will shift gaze suddenly, and so these like performative techniques can, I think at least, add atmosphere, and I think that's like a meta thing, but I think it can be very helpful.
You sort of scared me. What if you don't have a voice like that?
Sorry.
Well, I think something that Sharang brought up is very much on point, and as I mentioned earlier, is slowing down. Like slowing down really can increase tension, can really increase worry and concern, and I think the other part of it, and this is something that I get a lot of positive feedback about, is describing things in a very cool and calm and collected way. You could be describing something truly horrific and nauseating and disturbing, but if you do it in a very calm, like methodical, calm, clear way, that will creep people out intensely, because it is not what they are expecting. They're expecting like the horror, the jump, all that stuff. But when you do it just the same voice you've been using to talk about, like, oh, there's this rock over here. Oh, there, they don't expect it, and it gets them in a much, I think, deeper level, because there's an expectation that they have of what the horror will be like and how it will be delivered, and you're going against that expectation, and they're not expecting it.
It's the equivalent of the panning shot in the horror movie, which is sort of house, kitchen, bookshelf, ghost, kitchen, like that. I found another thing which can be quite effective is a sudden flip. So quite often when there's a character like a bad guy character. So like there was a crazy cult leader in the game of Creep that I played recently, and he was very, very polite and very, very nice until he wasn't. And there's just a kind of when he's just talking and then suddenly he's just talking much more forcefully, and you're not doing exactly what he says, so fucking do it. And that would make me hella uncomfortable in real life. So I think it works in game too. We keep coming back to Bluebeard's Bride, but I think that's just 'cause it's an excellent game. But I think that's one of the few games that I GM in character, because the bad guys essentially patriarchy there. So if normally when I'm running a game, I'm just running as Ollie. So you get stuff, and I might use some dramatic flares and stuff like that, but basically it's like talking to me. But with Bluebeard's Bride, I'm playing a character as much as anything else, and I think that comes across in the rules as well, because it's a very different thing to be the MC than it is to be the groundskeeper. The groundskeeper is a person, and you're playing that person.
So,
and I think that's sorry, did I interrupt someone?
Go ahead.
Oh, I think that's really interesting because in Bluebeard's Bride, not only are you the groundskeeper, but the game prompts you in disturbing ways to like use like misogynistic language. Like the game prompts you to be like, "You're a lady. Why do you think you would ever be able to do that?" And again, I have used that when I've DM'd the game, and I've said beforehand, "Hey, just saying, this is going to be me." But that's one thing. And secondly, similar to that, what we're just talking about is not just speech, but the last time I ran Bluebeard's Bride at Dreamation, I did a very deliberate thing of all the physical actions I was doing. So sometimes, like to create, the uncanny, sometimes I would like take a player's pencil like from them, which is something you do not expect when you're playing a role-playing game. Or I would like, when I ran it for some friends, some immersive theater friends, when they were 4 players, and so when I told them who wants to pick the last 2, they picked it. I like ripped the last sheet and threw it away. And so even the physical things you do. At one point, I went up to someone and I whispered in their ear, "Are you shivering with fear for me, sister?" And they shivered with fear because I whispered into their ear. Oh, that rhymes. And so these like physical things you can add. Obviously, you want to be careful not to overstep. If you are playing with people you don't know, you don't want to like get in their face and do things like that. But these used judiciously can be interesting techniques as well.
I do have an anecdote. I was playing Vampire, the new edition, in my backyard with Dave Kazay, who's known for Bedlam Hall most recently. And he at one point had me, he was the player, by the way. He had his arms around me from behind and the stake to my heart. And I, as the NPC, was reacting to that. And I've never been so scared in my life. So players, you can do that to us. And there's a photo on it somewhere on my social media. Look it up. But anyway, yeah.
Can I toss in one little little thing here? So I think there's a lot of again, I'm going to play the devil's advocate here in that a lot of the discussion we're having here is about extreme performativeness, and I think something else. Again, I feel like we just keep on coming back to Bluebeard's Bride, but like as I said, my running of Bluebeard's Bride is very cold and very consistent, and I think to a certain extent that one of the things that it's talking about a lot is how like patriarchy, et cetera, is part of women's experience, period, like always. And I think there's doing it in a very kind of calm, collected way throughout the whole thing kind of sends that home to an extent, because in that this is not, you want to think that this is unusual, you want to think that this is not normal, but this is normal. This is how it is. And I think I tend to do that also with like even the cosmic horror stuff, because like I think it's much creepier to think that actually this is what reality is really like. This is how things actually are. You just don't want to know that this is how things really are. And you don't want to acknowledge that this is how things are. So you don't need to be super performative. You need to be kind of intentional about it, I think. But that can take you to creepiness and horror in other ways.
Yeah, patronizing and depersonalization is one of the big things that works in that game in particular. And I think the reason that we do keep coming back to that game is one of the key things in horror is picking the right game. I mean, you can throw some horror into D&D, but you're still playing D&D. You're still there as monster hunters, and if there's a skeleton or a zombie, it's still just a bag of hit points that you're going to hit, and it's eventually going to die. If you're playing Final Girl, then you're playing a fun slasher movie. If you're playing Lovecraft-esque, then you're playing kind of like a mechanized campfire story. If you're playing Bluebeard's Bride, then you're playing feminine horror. You're always playing a very specific thing. Even if you don't think you are, even if you think you are just playing a role-playing game, and so you've just thrown some zombies into D&D, or even if you're playing Call of Cthulhu is the kind of the granddaddy of horror, but there's nothing there in the mechanics to model that terror, other than the sanity points, which I know in our sort of our pre-chat we all fairly hate.
Well, yeah, and we're already kind of closing into an hour, if you believe that. So I'd like to pivot a bit, and if we can leave some tips on the table for, specifically, if I'm a game master and I want to run horror, things that have worked for you. One thing that I can throw out there is that I come from D&D, so I tend to have the bag of hit points. So one of the things that I've learned and I do on the table when I'm running horror is I focus on the chase, not on the fight. I put characters into a situation in which they really have to run, even if it is D&D, because there's no way around. So the game is about that. What are some things like that you can talk about in your last round here to discuss things that have worked for you in running horror games?
One thing I'd say is I think it depends a lot on culture, and I don't mean play culture. I mean kind of like the culture that you are in, because a lot of the advice that's normally given is kind of like dim the lights, put up some candles, put on some creepy music. If you try that shit in England, people are just going to think dude, what you did. This just looks kind of silly, because there's an entrenched irony here that we don't do earnest well. I mean, that's not true of everyone. I'm generalizing the whole country, but generally that's our reputation. We're not an earnest country. So
Americans are very earnest.
Well, that's to go the other way. That's the generalization of Americans. Yeah, but I think that is I think that's an issue, is knowing what will work culturally for you, what people are gonna buy into and what people are going to find ridiculous, because there is always that balance. And if you step over into the ridiculous, then you've lost people.
I think small sensory details are very powerful. Now, of course, you're going to say, oh, that's true in every sort of genre. But in horror, small details about unexpected things can be like, A, it'll bring that, like, sometimes you can bring in that loveliness thing I talked about earlier. B, it can help misdirect, because a lot of horror is like someone said, like Shane was saying, right? You think a bad thing's going to happen, but then the bad thing happens somewhere else. So I remember the first time I ran Strahd at the 20-sided store in Manhattan, in Brooklyn, there'd be all these rooms in the haunted house that don't have that much going on, but you can like describe something in loving, lush detail, even if it's not very long. Loving doesn't mean like a long. You can like say a really interesting, small, cool detail about it, and people are immediately like, wait, why? Oh, what does that mean? And you're just describing the setting, and that can be obviously all the techniques we're saying don't overuse and things, but that can be very effective. Or if you're like walking down a dark corridor, you can enhance the horror by talking about a sense that you don't always talk about, like, I don't know, the feel of the wall in the darkness. Small sensory details are always effective and fun to come up with on the fly.
I'm going to follow up a little bit on what Sharang just said, in that I think something else that helps with creepiness is describing the usual, describing common things, and then having that one little thing that is off, that is very much off and disconcertingly off. And this kind of comes into what Ollie was saying about the pan, right? Is like, describe what's there, drop in that thing that is just so not okay, and then kind of finish up the description. And that will start to turn on that creepiness. That'll start to turn up that creepiness. And it's a pretty easy thing to do, in my opinion.
Awesome. I think we made it 3 minutes till. So why don't we take a moment? If anybody on in the Gauntlet or on the internet would like to talk to us about horror, where can they find you? I'm at Gray Author on Twitter, all over Facebook. Just look me up. You'll find me. What about you, Ollie?
I am at Jeffery on Twitter. And I will be on G+ for as long as it's there. And I am always very happy to talk about tabletop RPGs or horror. That's as it says in my bio.
Shane?
I am only on G+, really, on the social media. So yeah, Shane Liebling. You should be able to find me and reach out to me. Or if you're on the Gauntlet Slack, hit me up. And
I am Sharang Biswas on Twitter. It's my full name. There are very few people with that name, so I should be easy to find. And I love chatting with people. I'm not super involved in Discord. I actually really dislike using Discord, but I did for the con because that's what we're using. So tweet at me. I also have my website and stuff on Twitter if you are interested in that.
Great. Well, I hope you all are enjoying Gauntlet Con 2018, and we better get back to gaming. Chop, chop.